I think she's asking a question.
That F-16 jet, did the computer tell the flight person how to stay away from the mountains, the hills?
Well,
I think
interesting
that's
enough.
what I heard.
Yeah, it not only tells, although in our early versions we warned the pilot that he was about to hit the ground, and then it turns on the autopilot and the airplane automatically avoids all by itself. So that rolling and pulling you see is the pilot's not doing a thing. It was interesting, as we started to talk to the F-22 quite a few years ago, they asked, well, what can't this prevent? How can this, how does this system fail? It says, well, the only time it won't prevent it from hitting the ground, if the aircraft is healthy, is if the pilot overrides the system and pulls it to the ground. And the pilots unanimously said, take me out of the loop. Well, that's kind of stunning from a flight controls aircraft perspective, that a pilot would, of all things, suggest that. So since that day, every system we've developed actually locks the pilot's controls out while it's maneuvering. And it's the only man-rated aircraft in existence that does that. This is about to field next year. So it's a pretty big step in aviation for automation, that now when it decides to avoid at the most critical point, the pilot can't do a thing about it. It's completely in the hands of the computer. Because we had lots of data that showed the pilots would overreact, they would over-rotate, they'd corrupt the avoidance maneuver, and it would end up causing the aircraft to hit the ground. If we tried to account for that, we'd have to initiate it sooner to allow all that slop in there, and then it would start to become a nuisance because the pilots that weren't going to overcorrect would say, hey, no, I don't need it to avoid quite yet. So it will not let the pilot control the aircraft. In that brief time, you saw the avoidance maneuvers are very brief. A second, 1 to 3 seconds is how long it takes to get it out of a situation.
Any more questions?
After the maneuver, how long will the aircraft, or will the system manage the aircraft if you've caught the pilot off guard and put him to sleep in a high G maneuver or something like that?
We only have the autopilot active as long as the aircraft is in jeopardy of hitting the ground. We don't care if the pilot's conscious or not. So we give it back to the pilot, we keep the autopilot on long enough to arrest all the rates, because the F-16 can generate some pretty decent rates on it. So we freeze those rates and then hand it back to them. There's about a half a second autopilot maneuver that arrests all the rates. If he's unconscious, the F-16 is just going to drone along. If there's another mountain in front of him, it'll initiate when that happens, whether he's conscious or not. So as long, the F-16 doesn't have auto throttle, so as long as there's enough power in the throttle to keep it flying, Newton can't take over, so then we will keep avoiding the ground for as long as he's unconscious. But we give it back to him absolutely as soon as we need to, whether he's conscious or not. The DROID, the small UAV we have over here does have auto throttle, and we showed how the system could use auto throttle. Oh no, there is nothing looking at the real ground on this. It's all done in computers. We have there's no radar at all, and that's to keep the cost down. It's purely software. It has a computer model of the world in it. And so it understands what all the terrain looks like, and we've got basically every 100 feet, we know what the elevation is around the entire globe. And we've developed some special software so we can squish it down into only 140 megabytes, and so it's easy to carry on any, cell phone that you got nowadays. So it's just software. Now you do need GPS. You need to know where the aircraft is. So that aircraft has a GPS system on it already, and it understands what its bank angle is and that sort of thing. So that is fed into the algorithm. In the next year, there's no reason we couldn't use the GPS on the phone. And iPhones already have attitude information. Android platforms are just coming out with it this year. They are just last year they started to come out with it. So we're gonna, in fact, I got an advanced, just 3 weeks ago, Verizon gave me, I gotta give Verizon a plug, I suppose. They gave me a pre-release version of an Android phone that has attitude information. And so we're gonna go out and take a look at how accurate that is and see if it'd be appropriate to integrate into our system so that Figuring out when you need to avoid would be solely done on the phone, just as you carry it along. Now, it's not going to take control of the aircraft because there's nothing hooked up to the aircraft. We'll work on that part, though, as well. We got some plans for that. My intent is that one day, hopefully not much more than 5 years in the future, a civil aviation pilot would be able to download an application for his smartphone or iPad, whatever, and can just Velcro it to his cockpit, and he'll have at least a rudimentary ground collision avoidance capability. And if things go well, there may be some other sophistication added to that, which might even give him an auto recovery capability. But that's where we're hoping to go, so that we can basically provide leading edge technology that's going on to our frontline fighters to the general public at virtually no cost, is what I'm hoping for. There may be a slight download fee to maintain the software and keep adding additional features should they be needed. But if there is a cost to it, it's going to only be to make it better in the future.
Okay, as you pointed out, the reaction of the pilot is an important part of the system. So 10 years from now, will we find that pilots are flying much more risky maneuvers because they think this system has their back?
When we do research flight tests on systems like this, especially as obvious high-risk testing as is, because we get closer to the ground than anybody else does in the test community, it is considered the highest risk testing being done in aviation right now. To do that kind of testing, we have to make sure the system's not on when we take off, and we've turned it off before we land. We're very controlling about when that system is allowed to be on and have any influence on the aircraft. And that's just standard practice actually throughout flight tests. You never allow the system under test to be on throughout the entire flight. You control when you turn it on and you turn it off when you're not testing it. About halfway through the project, as we were having the pilots fly these low-level missions to evaluate if it was nuisance prone or not, engineering side, we could see they were getting more and more and more aggressive in their flying. And at one point, one of the pilots did a high G pull-up in front of a cliff face, and he didn't see some of the terrain that he was pulling towards. And he got extremely close to the ground. Came back from his flight, immediately came into me and said, "That thing would have let me kill myself." Says, you know, my gosh, you know, nuisance free, I don't even know it's working out there. Well, we went in and looked at the data, and no, the system had come on almost a second before he had gotten on the stick to react to the terrain he had seen, and in fact, it may have made the difference from him making it back from that flight and not. With that, test pilots, although they have a notable ego, they do accept new data when set in front of them. And they all quietly ran off without telling anyone, huddled, owned up to the fact that they were all flying more and more and more aggressively in our aircraft. And they all came back and said, you know, we've all thought about it. We feel much safer in that aircraft than any other aircraft on the ramp. And in fact, we are going to refuse to get in the cockpit again until we can turn that system on before we take off, and we don't shut it off until we're on the ground. And in the test pilot's words, it says, because if I run into the ground in that aircraft, St. Peter is going to turn me away from the pearly gates for being stupid. So, yes, there is the chance. However, we're going to be, you want to avoid Big Brother. And by no means are we, you know, NASA is in control of how this system is going to really be used. The way it apparently is going to be used within the Air Force is that it will track when an avoidance maneuver comes on, and actually the wing commander will be notified of that, because you want to make sure you're not training pilots to be poor pilots. And every pilot that I've sent through that aircraft, and we're up well over 50 pilots now, you can see after their very first mission of seeing the system in action, their whole attitude changes to the ground. It's really remarkable. This is a level of technology that goes far beyond anything they've ever seen. Any other questions? Yes?
Is there ever a time when they want to override the system?
Good question. Okay, now there's a little story behind all that. About 15 years ago, the F-22 was in development. Repeat the question. Oh, okay. The question was, is there ever a case where the pilots want to override the system? Very good question. And certainly in the pilot community, 10, 15 years ago, they absolutely were all over that. Well, is there an off switch, and can I override it? Well, about 15 years ago, went to talk to the F-22 about implementing it on the F-22. We showed all the cases that I end up supporting a lot of actual Air Force mishap investigations to see how well the system would apply. And I've been doing that for the last 20 years. And I went through case after case of how it would have prevented. And they said, well, is there any mishap case of controlled flight into terrain where it's a healthy aircraft that this wouldn't prevent? So it's like, well, there are cases where the pilot was disoriented and he actually tried to maneuver the aircraft in the wrong direction. And at that time we allowed the pilot to have full override authority, and in our words, we wanted to give the pilot the God-given right to kill himself. Well, the F-22 pilots, and these are the first initial pilots, very notable pilots in the test pilot community, said, well, take me out of the loop. And of course that was just stunning to us that any pilot would say that. So from that day forward, we worked it in so that the flight controls actually lock out his controls, because we do wait to the last instant, and the autopilot is very precise on the F-16, and it's executing the right maneuver. And anything that we ever saw that the pilot got in on the stick, he would corrupt that maneuver and would take more altitude to do the recovery, and we would either have to buffer the system and have it react sooner and therefore be nuisance prone, or take him out of the loop, and that's the way it's going to be fielded. So it's kind of notable from an aviation perspective. This is going to be the first system in a man-rated aircraft that actually takes the pilot out of the loop, and it takes him out of the loop at a very critical moment. Now he's only out of the loop for the brief time it's on, which is about a half a second to 3 seconds. If it's a real extreme dive, it may last for as much as 7 or 8 seconds to pull out. But most of the mishaps are just real brief maneuvers that need to be done to prevent that mishap. Any other questions?
Any other questions?
Got one back over there.
Here we got a microphone for you.
Is it loaded into the flight control computer or through the data transfer cartridge or a fire control integration?
You're an F-16 guy. Okay, so the F-16 is what's called a Federated Architecture. Well, what does that mean? It's a whole bunch of different computer systems that kind of work on their own independently, and they talk across a communications bus. We've distributed it on the F-16 across the different, the autopilot is in the flight controls, and there is a part of the health checking that's going on to make sure the system's working well enough to take control of the aircraft that's in the flight controls. All the algorithms that are figuring out the terrain and what the aircraft's maneuver is going to be out of that autopilot are done in the data transfer unit, which actually they're getting upgraded in, just gotten upgraded with a new data transfer unit and data transfer cartridge that holds the terrain just in the last year. And the next software update for those systems will have this, the auto collision avoidance system. So part of it's in the data transfer equipment, others in the flight controls. For our aircraft, we use, on the small UAV, we use a commercial off-the-shelf autopilot, and we just command it to do the maneuver that it could do, that anyone could command, but we just have the computer command it, and then we have the algorithm running on the cell phone. We use the aircraft's GPS to figure out where it is, and some of its other sensors to figure out what bank angle it's at and that sort of thing. We're hoping to move to the phone sensors in the next year.
How about a round of applause for him for another wonderful presentation?